Welcome back to Designing in Color's 2020 webinar series, the GRIOT. By now, you have been able to hear stories from different guests and learn about their contributions in their respective industry, along with the impact they've had on their communities. Today's episode is Multilingual GRIOT's storytelling. The intent of this episode is to share stories in different languages, both in English and in Spanish, and we will break this episode into two parts. I'd like to graciously thank our guests for giving their time to share their story with us. Our first storyteller is Ricardo Millhouse, a Black queer designer, a son, a brother, an uncle, a Southerner, an educator, an activist, a researcher, a listener, and a facilitator. Welcome, Ricardo.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you for, organizing this and in this moment, considering all that's going on. Thank you.
Thanks. Ricardo is a designer at Gold Evans, a PhD candidate at Arizona State University in the School of Social Transformation, and is a treasurer for NOMA, Arizona. He has taught at Syracuse and Arizona State University in geography and gender studies, respectively. He teaches courses related to queer theory, justice, and human geography. His research focuses on the ways that Black queer people craft, hone, and maintain their personhood in and outside of Black queer spaces. He also investigates how, why, and to what ends Black queer spaces are necessary in gentrifying cities such as Brooklyn, New York. Before graduate school and teaching, he worked with a nonprofit in Chicago that focused on economic development on the West Side. Most importantly, his professional career and community engagements have been influenced by his lived experiences as a Black gay Southerner. Thanks again, Ricardo, for taking the time to speak with me. For those who may not know, I met Ricardo about 2 years ago through NOMA, Arizona, and although we've known each other for a few years already, this is really the first time I get to sit down and know more about you because we have always been so busy at the chapter meetings and events. So I'm actually very excited for our conversation today.
I'm excited as well to kind of share space and engage in conversation. So it'll be great.
Our first question, I'm very impressed by your extensive background, your research and variety in your work. Could you share a bit about your journey that led you into the design industry?
I don't necessarily have a linear trajectory into the design industry. I think there were a lot of questions that I had at different parts and times of my life that kind of made me question a lot of things. And what I mean by that is, I grew up in Mobile, Alabama, right? And Mobile sits on the Gulf Coast of Alabama, and it's a smaller size city, around 189,000 people. And I just had a lot of questions regarding housing and school segregation, because I would, I took like 2 buses to get to my middle school, and on the ride, I just saw like drastic changes between neighborhoods. And so as like a 9, 10, 11, 12-year-old, I had all these questions about like why certain areas look different than other areas. And so all of these, I didn't have like the vocabulary at the time, but I know that those experiences shaped my professional and community engagement choices up to today. And so I found design as like a tool to intervene in the questions and the things that were going on spatially. And so that is how I came to design. So through all these questions that I had, and I came into design knowing that I wanted to use design and architecture as a way to answer the questions and to affect people's lives and to affect change.
That's a great story. I think that one thing that I was always curious to learn more about you whenever you would talk during the meetings was just knowing a little bit more about the different areas in your life that shape who you are today, because you've mentioned different areas that are not typically heard in a traditional um, design professional. And so I was really curious to learn more about how you got into the design industry. So it intrigues me that you're currently pursuing a PhD while working as a designer at a firm. And I like to know how these different areas inform each other in the work that you do.
It's a great question. I had all these questions about space and how people utilize space and how spaces inform people's lives, support people's lives, or shape people's lives. And so I wanted to answer these questions, right? And so that's what I aim to do at ASU, in my research and my studies. But also for a while, I thought about the two as separate entities and separate things. Um, but I think they're mutually dependent on each other. They're co-constitutive in a lot of ways. And so I wanted to answer these questions about gentrification and displacement and vanishing spaces, and like these, what was happening around me is that, every time I would go home, like there would be long-term businesses that were closed, right? The neighborhoods didn't look like they did when I was 5 or 6. And that I think that mattered to how I, approach, you know, um, my PhD. And it's a lot of um, it has a lot to do with the questions that I had at the time. Okay, well, since these structures and businesses are gone, where are people going, right? Where are people congregating now? Where are people living now? Where are they going to school? I had all these questions, and so I wanted to do a lot of, of a mapping exercise, if you will, but also an intellectual exercise as far as, okay, what is the impact of gentrification on, you know, people's lives? And so I used design as well to support my investigations. I wanted to know how spaces are, informing people's experiences, and how marked spaces specifically are are significant to people's lives. And so I wanted to, merge the two, my two professions, to just find a way to think through all these things, all these entanglements in a way that I think isn't necessarily talked about in the design world a lot, or as much as it needs to be talked about in my perspective. So that's how I approach, design and my studies.
So, as a researcher, I'm sure your interest in topics has grown over time. Are there any new topics you're currently researching or are interested in?
Absolutely. Just to sit in this moment and reflect on all that has been happening. Um, we've lost a lot of Black LGBTQ people in these last few months, um, and at the hands of police officers, right? And this moment has kind of awakened a lot of people, and it's also kind of it has hit me to my core in the sense that, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, Ahmaud Arbery, Deion Johnson, these are people who look like me. And, I just want there to be structural change, right? And I'm thinking about this intense moment. I'm thinking about the rising number of cases relative to COVID. I'm thinking about even in jails and prisons right now. I'm thinking about the rising number of COVID cases in jails and prisons. And related to that, I'm thinking about de-incarceration. And so I'm thinking about it in terms of how is design being, used as a tool to affect change, right? And to affect transformation. So we think about, you mentioned Brian Lee. Brian Lee came out with an article not too long ago, I think at the beginning of this month, right? And to think about how the design of spaces were meant to oppress people. And so how we as designers should have our intention should be refocused on understanding that we live under a system that is broken, and our profession is a extension of that broken system. And how can we how can we understand this moment right now, sit in this moment, pause and reflect, and understand that we're doing it wrong, and how can we kind of make things right. And so that's what I'm interested in right now. And again, just to reiterate, at the beginning of our conversation, we were talking about, different parts in my life that brought me to design.
Mm-hmm.
This is what I'm talking about. Like when things happen, it doesn't have to be, on television. There's just moments of inspiration that happens, and moments that require a call of action, like the moment we're in right now, to kind of move me and motivate me to effect change. And I think, if I'm at ASU, teaching students about structural and institutional racism, and in my professional life, I'm thinking about how can we as designers make sure that we're not making the same mistakes in designing the buildings that is going to squeeze these very same spaces that are occupied and depended upon by Black LGBTQ people.
You were talking about how events have shaped your way of thinking and your work. And as we keep saying, as designers, we tend to look at spaces differently, and we typically work towards creating experiences for people. As a Black queer man, what has been your experience with relationship to space, and how has that influenced your work overall?
Just to expand on what we were just talking about, I approach, design, I approach, my work related to ASU and my writing. I always have, the intention and the significance of space in the front of my mind. And I think about how space is required and significant to Black LGBTQ people, right? This month is Pride Month, right? And so, it was a riot at the Stonewall Inn that started, Pride, the Pride movement, the LGBTQ movement, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it was a movement that was started by Marsha P. Johnson. And so I always think about how the act of and the movement that ensued after, Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera started, just the energy that they had and the intentions that they had was, look, I'm here, listen to me, I matter, And so for me, I think about that experience and that history and juxtapose it with the squeezing out of Black LGBTQ just spaces of fellowship, such as Langston's in Brooklyn, right? It was a long-standing business in Brooklyn for queer people. And so now that it's been closed down, I just think about how, in 1 minute, the physical space is, one can think about how it's important for them and their survival, and it's significant to them, and the next minute it's vanished. And so those are the type of moments that I think about, when either I'm in the office, or, I'm, sitting down to write, or anything. I'm always thinking about that history, and the importance of space, just for survival. Um, yeah.
To add to that, as we speak about relationship to space, how do you define sacred space, and what would you consider your sacred space to be?
Hmm. Sacred space. I would say sacred space, in my perspective, is a space that has not been touched by capitalism and white supremacy. And, and in white supremacy, you have anti-black racism, you have homophobia and transphobia, and a sacred space is a space that is protected from that. Does that place exist? That's debatable, but that will be, a sacred space in my eyes, a space where, you know a space that's protected from oppression. And so, as designers, we can think about that and sit with that definition, for a minute, and wonder, do those places exist, and why not? And so for me, I don't think a sacred space has to be physical. It can be, or marked. It can be unmarked. It could be public. It could be private. Um, for me, whenever I'm, you know, at work, or if I'm going into, um, a lecture or something, or even right now, like before we started talking, I think about, you know, a creek, in behind my grandmother's house that had a brook, and it came to me in a dream, and so I always think about that space because it was just so quiet and tranquil, and I was the only person there, uh, and it calms me, it slows things down for me, uh, and just the trickling of the water, the softness of the breeze, um, the movement of the trees against the wind, the sun shining not too brightly, but it's like a happy hour almost. Um, and so that would be a sacred space for me. That's what I think about whenever I think about, oh, let me go to my sacred space.
It sounds like you just described my sacred space. Literally, everything you described, it's like, okay, that's my secret space. Being in an industry that is predominantly led by white males, I personally haven't met many queer designers throughout my career, especially Black queer designers. And ever since I met you through Noma, I've heard you openly share who you are during the meetings, and I honestly applaud you for doing that. I think that it's entirely due to your courage of sharing your story, as well as our chapter creating a safe space that allows you and other people to be who they identify as. Given that your professional career and community engagements have been influenced by your lived experiences as a Black gay Southerner, could you please share a story of one of these experiences that has stuck with you this whole time?
Yes. So, what kind of story do you want?
Any story. It's judge-free zone.
um,
You can get real here.
oh, okay. So I will tell you that in high school, um, me and a friend, we went to, we were like 17, 18 at the time. We went to downtown, Mobile, and we wanted to, we had just finished, I think our last finals of high school, so we were just like trying to hang out and just have some fun. So, we were 17 at the time, and I took my mom's car, borrowed my mom's car. I asked her permission. It's fine, but I picked my friend up. We went downtown, but we wanted to go to this skate club. And so unfortunately we weren't 18 yet. So we just like kind of like hung out outside, and it just, the feeling of being in community with people who looked like us, and who, or me, and who identified into like I identify. And that moment always stuck with me, because just knowing that we were just outside of this bar and just talking to people and just hanging out and dancing, that even though that even though we didn't go inside, it was just good to be in community. And so a couple years later, I heard that it closed down. And so that feeling of being in community can't necessarily be reproduced or like felt again by someone who looks like me, right? And so that is what sticks with me all the time. We design buildings and spaces for people to have these long-term felt experiences. And that's important. But I want our industry, and I want, the academy to understand that our vector lines have consequences, and development has consequences. And the fact of the matter is, here I am years later, past that experience, but it has stuck with me. Like, it brings me joy just sitting here right now reflecting on that experience. And so I would say that that story has stuck with me the most.
That sounds like a great story. Thanks for sharing that one. What are your plans after you complete your PhD? Where do you see yourself in, let's say, 5 years, 10 years? Have you thought about that? Or are you currently just trying to focus in the moment and get through everything that's going on right now?
I would say the latter. Like, there's a lot going on, to where there's so much to get involved in. There's so many different ways to get plugged in. There's so many things to do, like things to fix. Like, you can turn on the TV and just think about, how can I get involved in amplifying the voices of those who aren't necessarily in the meetings that we're in. And how can I get involved with voting rights? How can I educate myself on what voter suppression is? How can I educate myself on structural racism, institutional racism? How can I educate myself on um, trans writers, trans experiences? How can I get involved in any way? And that is what I'm focused on. Just having conversations with people day to day, and just thinking about these issues. And to your question about where do I see myself in 5 years, I want to continue doing the work that I'm doing now, which is to teach people about the history and legacies of settler colonialism and white supremacy that has, I guess, created and maintained this broken system that we navigate day by day. And also understand that design doesn't necessarily have to happen in a vacuum, that our work in and of itself impacts people's lives. And I think we can use design as a tool and a medium through which we can affect change, you know, at whatever scale. And so that is the work that I want to continue doing.
I really appreciate you for sharing your story with myself and DCO and the audience. You have some amazing thoughts and words of wisdom to share. And before we end our conversation, are there any final thoughts you would like to share with people or any advice you want to give? I'll leave it up to you.
I would say trust yourself, believe in yourself, and just because there it hasn't been an example of something that you would like to do, you can create that path for yourself and also for other people who want to have that similar experience that you have. You know, I don't think there are many people who um kind of think about the impacts that I think about as well. And so that makes my experience unique. And so I think for people who are thinking that you can't do something just because you haven't seen it be done, do it. Like just do it. I'm not trying to, just say like, oh, do what you have to do. Of course, there are going to be obstacles. It's going to be hard. There's going to be a lot of failures and obstacles and challenges, right? But that's what it takes sometimes. But I hope that this conversation, resonates with someone. I know I'm sure DCO, the work of DCO that you're doing in DCO, reaches a lot of people. But I would just reiterate that, you can be the change that you would like to see in the world. And your experience matters. Don't try to dim your light for someone else, but amplify your voice, make it be heard because people are paying attention.